the objective rational knowledge to become universal. It was this question of space, the question of time, but also the question of culture. It needed to be able to claim that it was transcultural. It also needed to claim that it was transhistorical, meaning that it applied to all particular, or rather to all historical moments. In as much as this knowledge is emerging in Europe in the 16th century, it needed to claim to be true for all times, for all historical moments. It even wanted to suggest, and as it does today, that you perhaps would think of what you learn in medicine today as being true also of the 1400s. You think that, the solutions you have to disease today, you could apply them to the 1400s. So your conclusions are retrospectively valid, even to prior to the time when they come into existence. That's what universality does, because you have transgressed the boundaries of time, of the historical moment within which that knowledge applies. So you're literally saying that what you discovered in the 16th century is also true of the 11th century. Do you get the point? It's not just the point, it's a paradox. How do you claim that what you discovered in 1600 is true for the 11th century? What is it that makes it true for the 11th century? I mean, there are close to 5 centuries in between. But you want to suggest that, your knowledge that is a latter day knowledge is also true of an earlier historical time. But we'll see in a moment, how we landed to that point. So the claim to universality needed to address the bounds of time. So it needed to be able to claim to be transhistorical. But also it needed to be able to claim to be transcultural. It needed to be able to claim that it is not limited in its validity by the particular cultural context within which it emerged. So it needed to be able to say that in as much as this knowledge emerges out of the European cultural context, it is also true of the African cultural context. It needed also to be able to say that in as much as it emerges out of the European cultural context, it is true of the Middle Eastern or the Arabic culture context. So it needed to transgress the boundaries of culture. It needed to be able to transgress the boundaries of time. It also needed to be able to transgress the boundaries of space. It needed to be able to travel outside of Europe, because if it remained confined in Europe, its claim to validity would have been shallow. I mean, if it claimed to be universal, but it was only known in Europe, that universal validity would have been limited in space and time, or rather in space in this particular context. So this knowledge, in as much as it had already claimed scientificity for itself, it had claimed to be based on reason, rationality, and objectivity, that was not enough to make it universal. It needed something else. It needed resources with which to transgress the bounds of culture, the bounds of time, and the bounds of space. How did it do that? Now, there is one thing that enables this knowledge to travel the world. It is capital. There is one thing that makes this knowledge able to transgress all of these boundaries. It is capital. It travels the world on the back of capital. So wherever capital has been, this knowledge finds its foot. Or, in simpler terms, wherever capital has been, it ensures that it implants this order of knowledge that emerges in Europe, that claims for itself rationality and reason. Do you follow? Now, capital. In simpler terms, capital is much more than just capitalism. But in simpler terms, let us understand what I mean by capital. Let us understand capitalism, or the logic of capitalism. So, capitalism had begun to emerge in Europe in the 1500s with what we call merchant capitalism. Now this capitalism, or this form of an economic system, began to spread outwardly from Europe, as from the 1500s, when merchant capitalism was the dominant logic of capitalism. But by the 1600s, merchant capitalism had been transformed into modern industrial capitalism. So when the significance of the 1600s, perhaps we must specify. Now the significance of the 16th century, perhaps we must specify, because this is the beginning of the modern period in Europe. This is also when capitalism transitions from being merchant capitalism into more industrial capitalism. What happens in Europe in the 1600s was basically the beginning of, or the leaving behind of the animate sources of energy into the inanimate sources of energy. This is the time when Europe leaves behind its dependence on animate sources of energy and begins to depend on inanimate sources of energy, which is a larger way of, or a more complex way of thinking about industrialization. This is when Europe industrializes. This is the beginning of the industrial revolution in Europe. Now the revolution, the industrial revolution that happens in the 16th century transformed the economy of Europe. But it did not only transform the economy of Europe, it did not only bring an industrialized capitalist economy, it brought something else along, which we are going to see in a moment. So, from the 16th century onwards, there began in Europe what we know as modern industrial capitalism. Now this modern industrial capitalism was nothing new. It was a continuation of capitalism. Basically what happens is that at this moment capitalism morphs into a different stage. There had been merchant capitalism before industrial capitalism. So what happens in the 16th century is that there began a new era, in capitalism. Now I mentioned this even though it's not quite related, because of, very pedestrian discussions of globalization that suggest that, globalization is a recent thing that began, in the 70s, 80s. Globalization began in the 1500s. Merchant capital sought to universalize itself, to globalize itself. That's why they sent the ships across the seas, because capital wanted to be global. What industrial capitalism does, it makes that process even easier because there is now a discovery of much faster and modern forms of transport. With the coming of the technology later on, that globalization takes a different form. So globalization is it has a much longer history than the history that is often peddled, today, as if globalization began with communication technology. Now, it began way before that. But the point is that we want to see how this knowledge would be enabled by capital to become universal, to transgress space, to transgress time, to transgress, history and culture, rather. So with the coming of modern industrial capitalism in Europe in the 1600s, there is industrialization Hence we call these societies industrial societies. Now the coming of modern capitalism did not just mean the transformation of the means of production. In order for capitalism, modern industrial capitalism to function, it also needed to transform people's outlook. It needed to transform the way in which people thought. It needed to transform the way in which people interacted with each other, the way in which people interacted with the world, and the way in which people interacted, with the environment generally. It needed people who had modern sensibilities. In order for capitalism to be able to function, it could not just produce in the factory. It needed people who would see the logic of production in the factory. So in a simpler way, capitalism could not just produce the goods in the factory, in the industries. It needed people who had tastes for those goods. It needed people to value those goods so that they would buy them. Because otherwise, if industrial capitalism went ahead and just produced the commodities that it produced without creating taste in the people, then these commodities would have become useless. So you needed to create a market, for these commodities that you were producing. So people did not dress the way we dress today prior to the 16th century. But because now there is a modern textile industry that comes into existence with, industrial capitalism, what does capitalism say? It says that as a modern person, you must appear in a certain way, you must dress in a certain way. In order for the textile industry to survive. But it did not end there. It also said that as a modern person, you must have this kind of a diet. You must feed in this way. Because you needed people who had certain tastes in order to feed, the food industry that was emerging alongside, in Europe in the 16th century. So virtually every aspect of society, as from the modern period onwards, became subject to the logic of capitalism. The way in which we dressed, the way in which we fed ourselves, the way in which, we lived in the world, the kind of housing we lived in, and the kind of amenities that we thought were necessary for us to live, were all supplied to us by the logic of capitalism. These things are not natural. There is nothing natural about the fact that you must eat cereal in the morning. You can wake up in the morning and eat same. Nothing will happen to you. You will continue to live, but capitalism requires you to eat wheat so that the wheat industry will continue to survive. It says to you that of necessity to be healthy, you must eat cereal in the morning. But that is only in order so that the wheat industry must continue to survive. So the food culture, everything, virtually everything about our lives became dictated by the logic of capitalism or by the logic of capital. Now this is how then capitalism spreads to the rest of the world, because as we've said, capital began to spread outwardly from Europe. Now wherever capital went, it ensured that it transformed the human beings it encountered there in order that they may appear in a certain way. So when capital left Europe and came to Africa, it met people who had a different sense of time. Our sense of time was not the Gregorian calendar. Our sense of time was not the time of the clock. But capitalism would not have been able to function unless we subscribe to the time of the clock and to the Gregorian calendar, because it would then not be able to measure the labor hours that we have put in a day. And so, wherever capital goes, it ensures that it integrates people into a certain logic of its own functioning. Now, the only reason we need time, as we know it today, it's only so that capitalism would function. You could live in society knowing only day and night. That's enough, without knowing hours. But you need to know hours because capitalism needs to be able to calculate, the labor, time, hours, or ratio that you put in, so that it can then remunerate you on the basis of that. Aren't people claiming to be economists because they master the calculations of, labor time calculations? Basically, we needed to be able to feed into the logic of modern industrial capitalism. So the entirety of life needed to be transformed in order to ensure that it was in consonance with the logic of capital. So this is how then, wherever capital went, so as it left Europe, it came to Africa, it encountered people who had a different sense of time, it encountered people who had a different sense of dress, it encountered people who had a different mode of being in the world, who related to each other differently. It said that the way in which you relate to each other is not congenial to being modern. So you now needed to relate to each other as human beings differently, because in order for capitalism to function, you needed a mass society. So our old societies that were, affinal societies where we related on the basis of blood, were told that these societies were not congenial to modern development. Because capitalism needed new sensibilities where, as a human being in a capitalist society, you are substitutable. Your essence as an individual in a modern system is that you are substitutable. See, as Lwazi Lushaba, as a lecturer at UCT, I'm not a human being. I'm basically fulfilling a role and a function. I'm substitutable. I'm just a worker who's substitutable. If anything happens to me, they will remove me and put somebody else who's going to perform the same role. So in modern capitalist society, you become basically a functionary that is substitutable. Your humanity as a person gets trimmed down into being basically an element in the turning of the capitalist machine. So virtually everything you do, your aspirations in life, all you're aspiring to is to fit in your shoulder into the cog of capitalism so that it can turn. So, what happens in the modern period is that industrial capitalism, as we've said, transforms virtually every facet of life, so that when you become modern, you become this person, who is knowable. So without knowing a modern person, if I said to you, if you go to India, you are going to encounter a modern person, you have an image of that modern person, isn't it? You can almost tell what that person looks like. It means that now what you have are people who have been standardized universally all over. What you have standardized are human beings who think in a certain way. A modern person in India is a person who subscribes to, the time of the clock, isn't it? It's someone who's going to understand when you say we're meeting at 8:30. When you say there is a modern person in India, you are going to encounter someone, who encounters the world in a certain way, who has a rational, calculable relationship with the world, such that when you encounter that person and you have an argument with that person, you are likely to say to that person, but what you are saying is not rational. Isn't it? Or you're not listening. Because a modern person you expect is a modern, rational, reasonable person who subscribes to the time of the clock, who's obeying, who has all the features of a modern person. So what capitalism does, wherever it goes, it transforms human beings into a model, a standard model of modern human beings. So what it does is not to universalize knowledge. No, it is not knowledge, it is not oncology, it is not accounting, it is not, chemistry or physics that becomes universal. No. it is a people who think in a certain way. Do you get the logic? So it is a people who, because they are modern, when you tell them about, I'm at the University of Cape Town, I study chemistry, you expect them to understand. So when I say there is a modern person, there are things that this modern person you expect must understand. There is a way in which this modern person must appreciate these things. So when you say to this modern person, I'm at the University of Cape Town, I study oncology, you expect this modern person to be, awed by the fact that you are studying such an important universal discipline, isn't it? Now you would actually say, there is something wrong with this person if the person says to you, oh, okay, oncology, okay. How important is it? You think there is something wrong with that person. Because a modern person ought to behave in a certain way, ought to have a certain outlook and a certain rational, calculable relationship with, the world and with everything in the world, including modern knowledge. So, the spread of capitalism outwardly from Europe was to ensure, alongside other things, that it created people in a certain image. It created people everywhere in a certain image. These people would become modern rational subjects. These would become modern people who are infused with modern sensibilities, who have a certain modern sense of time, a modern sense of space, and all of that. Such that, in fact, to demonstrate further, a modern person is someone who habits space in a certain way. You think that as a modern person is someone who habits space in a certain way. So if you encountered a modern person who says, well, I live here, but I make no claim to this place as mine. It is only just a place that enables me to live. I hope in some other time to move somewhere else without laying a claim to this place. You think there's something wrong with that person. Because as a modern person, you've come to think of space as delimited and that must have proprietorship. So when the person says that I have no aspiration to have proprietorship over the space that I live in, you think that there is something, odd with that person. That person is not modern. In fact, to be modern has become equated with being normal. The norm of modernity has exceeded just the cultural, it has also become a psychological norm. So the norm of being modern, all these things that we've said about being modern, when someone does not fit into them, you think there's something psychologically out of tune with that person. There's nothing out of tune with the person at all. It is simply that you assume what is a modern creation to be a natural state of affairs. Modern knowledge is not a natural state of affairs. The world as we live in it today could be different than it is today. So, the universality of knowledge that we encounter in the universities today, would be accomplished. Those limitations of history, space, and time were attended to thanks to the outward spread of capital to the rest of the world. Such that even today, you can have a sense of what capital does wherever it goes. Wherever modern capital gets, it does not just lead to production of commodities. It transforms society, isn't it? So when you take, for instance, industrial capitalist development to rural areas where these modern precepts of life have been kept at bay, what does that industry do? One factory in a rural area, what does it do? It transforms people's way of life. It transforms their outlook. Everything changes, their food culture, their sense of time, and everything changes. Now this is how modern knowledge traveled the world on the back of capital. But here was the tragedy for us in the continent. It is that capital came to us not just as capital. Capital, its coming to the continent was mediated by yet another process, the process of colonialism. Capital did not leave Europe on its own to come to the continent. It was brought to the continent, or its arrival, its birth on the shores of the continent was midwifed by colonialism. So colonialism came to alter the logic of capital. So capitalism, as it came to Africa, was not capitalism as it existed in Europe. It was capitalism that was now infused with a different logic. A logic summed as the license for the European or for the white to consider the African or the black as less than human. So capitalism comes to us infused with that logic. It comes to us laced with the license for the European or the white person to consider the African or the black as less than human. Such that even though capitalism exploits workers in Europe, it exploits workers differently in the continent. Capitalism came to exploit workers in the continent not as workers, in fact. It came to exploit them as black people. So what happens is that capitalism is not, quote and unquote, does not come into the continent in its pure state. It comes into the continent as colonial capitalism, for the lack of a better term, as distorted capitalism, distorted by the logic of colonialism. So what you find is that the spread outwardly of this modern sensibility to the continent is also a colonial spread. It is a spread of colonialism. Now, so that we may not lose the relationship this has with modern disciplines, that we are concerned with the coloniality of knowledge, it is that we must go back to a point we made earlier, that knowledge existed in Europe prior to the modern period. But knowledge prior to the modern period in Europe did not aspire to universalize itself. But there was something else also about this knowledge prior to the modern period. It is that this knowledge was organized differently. As we said, chemistry, biology, history, physics did not exist up until the 1600s. Now, what necessitates the disaggregation of knowledge into these different disciplines from the 16th century onward? Again, the answer is simple. As we said that the production in the factory transforms society and requires people to think in a certain way. Capitalist production also required an order of knowledge that would enable capitalism to reproduce itself. So all the disaggregation of knowledge into different disciplines today was basically a response to the dictates of industrialism. So when the modern period industrializes, the factories soon brought into existence the need for physics. When industrial production came into existence, soon it brought the need for engineering. When industrial capitalism came into existence, it brought the need, for accounting, for economics as a discipline as we know it. So, these disciplines themselves emerged specifically in the 16th century in order to save this capitalism. These disciplines have no relevance outside of capitalism. If the world were to cease to be capitalist, these disciplines would have no need to exist. Because if you encountered an honest doctor, medical practitioner, they will tell you that the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, its first objective is not to heal people. Its first objective is to make money. So, every discipline functions with that logic. So your discipline, whether it is accounting, whether it is engineering, whatever, all those disciplines, at the base of them is that same logic. How do we enable the maximization of profit? Now, in certain instances, in some other disciplines, that logic is not very direct to the industry. In the social sciences, what we do is to basically fashion people's thinking so that it is amenable to capitalism, so that people then have certain tastes. So marketing, the purpose of marketing is to create in people certain tastes. So when I market cigarettes, for instance, when I work for British American Tobacco, my concern is not your health. My concern is how to inculcate in you a taste for a product that you would buy in order that capitalism may continue to reproduce itself. So all the disciplines, some more directly, function with this logic of enabling, commodity production, or of enabling, the maximization of profit. Some other disciplines do that indirectly by inculcating in people a certain, outlook that would make them consumers, of certain commodities. Now you see this at moments of crisis in any particular, society. Any country, when faced with economic challenges, when economies contract, as they do, capitalist economies contract, and there is less money available for the academy, the first casualties are the humanities and social sciences. It is simply because they are secondary. Their task is to create in people a certain consciousness so that they become consumers. Why is it that when there is a crisis, physics continues to have, or chemistry continues to have more importance? It is simply because physics enables directly, the functioning of the capitalist industry. And so, in moments of crisis, it is the social sciences that get less funding, or that, whose departments get closed. But also, you only need to, later on in life, you will get to know how money circulates in the academy. Money in the academy basically does not follow bright people. Money in the academy basically goes to those disciplines that directly enable the functioning of capitalism. So that is why there is more money that goes into the science than there is that goes into the other disciplines. The importance is not in the disciplines themselves. The importance is in relation to the functioning of capitalism. So you would think, for instance, that public health is an important discipline that should have all the money poured into it. But because public health is not directly related to the functioning of capitalism, money would rather go into the production of drugs rather than go into public health, because industry is what becomes the allocator of value, even in the production of knowledge. So knowledge itself, its compartmentalization into the modern disciplines was dictated to by the logic of industrial capitalism. So the disaggregation, the disciplines that we habit today, psychology, sociology, and all of these disciplines, these are capitalist disciplines. These are disciplines that are aimed at explaining, for instance, in psychology, the psychology of a modern person. Psychology is not concerned with explaining the psychology of someone who lives outside of a capitalist society. In fact, psychology fails once you take it to those societies that fall outside of capitalism, because psychology knows of a certain structure of the mind. You know, the first thing a psychologist would ask you when you go see him or her is your family, your work. Where do you work? What's the nature of your workplace? Who's your boss? And all of those kinds of things. Because it is assumed that the psychology of a modern person is made up in a certain way. And so these disciplines are structured precisely in that way, just as it is that if you're a badly trained political scientist, all that you think of are the modern institutions of power. You cannot make sense of those societies that are not structured in accordance with the logic of the modern, structure. So, as we near closing, my point so far has been to say that the disaggregation of the disciplines today and of modern thought today is nothing but dictated, a logic dictated by industrial capitalism. So, the universality claimed for knowledge is not the universality of knowledge itself. It is the universality of capitalism, but also the universality of the modern form of life that capitalism imposes to other societies. But as we've said, the tragedy for us in Africa is that capitalism comes to us via colonialism. Meaning that when it comes to us via colonialism, it is no longer, quote unquote, capitalism in its pure form, as it existed in Europe. It is capitalism that is infused with the logic, with the colonial logic, as we've said, a logic that considers us as less than human, being African. Now, this consideration of us as less than human, but also as people who were at the receiving end of the spirit of capitalism, meaning that we're also at the receiving end of knowledge, because remember we said that objective, rational, and objective knowledge travels the world, becomes universal on the back of capital. So it knows where it originates from. Capital knows its source, it's Europe. The knowledge that travels the world on the back of capital also knows its source. It is Europe. So when it encounters us in the non-Western world or in Africa, it considers us always as recipients. So we are passive recipients of this knowledge. It always has to be given to us. We cannot generate it because it has its own place of origin. It has its own culture context. It has its own date of origin, which is Europe. When it comes to us, it has to be fed to us. So we are locked because of colonialism and the spread of capital from Europe to this part of the world. We are locked in a certain relationality with modern knowledge. Modern knowledge holds us as African people only as people to be given knowledge, to be accorded knowledge, or to be integrated into knowledge. It does not consider us as co-equals in the generation of this knowledge. It does not have, so the categories of modern thought, its vocabulary, does not have space to accommodate our own vocabulary. It does not have space to accommodate our sensibilities because it comes to us already fully formed. But not only does it come to us fully formed, it comes to us with a certain arrogance. That is the arrogance of colonialism. We went to Africa to civilize a certain people so that they may enter into rationality, reason, and objectivity. So the task of modern knowledge when it comes to Africa is to integrate us into this, modern knowledge. Now, this is where the limitation, for instance, of our discourse on decolonization has been. The desire has been to say No, there existed in Africa prior to colonialism sociologies. So you must teach us our own sociologies. Or when the discourse comes from, those who resisted decolonization, they would say, so if you say you want to decolonize knowledge, who were your philosophers? Or who were your political scientists, who were your mathematicians? And then we scramble to find sociologists and philosophers in the pre-colonial period and say, no, here they were, you must teach them. Now you've already lost the battle. If your object is to say, no, we were like you. Like you, we had our philosophers. Like you, we had our, mathematicians. Like you, we had. What you miss in that whole point is that the modular example that you want to be like is given by capitalism. So you are basically saying that we also want to be integrated into your existing category. So the object of decolonization has to be something else other than getting ourselves integrated into capitalist knowledge. We have to think a little harder into what kind of society we want so that the knowledge we produce would be the knowledge that enabled us to perpetuate that kind of society. Because if we accept the logic of colonial modernity, if we accept the logic of capitalism that is brought to us by colonialism, what I call colonial modernity, it is that we are going to perpetually remain Peter Pan's children who must forever be taught. We would have nothing to teach in return because, as we've said, already the categories are determined, already the vocabulary is determined, everything else is determined. So what you will be doing is to integrate yourself into an existing structure. And that is why it is possible to find a black person teaching colonial knowledge. It does not necessarily follow that when you have black academics, then you have decolonized knowledge. Because you can have black academics who integrate themselves into the existing, corpus of knowledge and perpetuate that same knowledge. And so, the task of decolonization is not the task of replacing Western academics or white academics with black academics. That is necessary, of course. It is a starting point. That's where we need to start, but we must go beyond that point because we are not likely to find decolonized education or decolonized knowledge unless we already have inculcated a cadre of black academics that are critical enough and self-respecting enough to want to transgress those boundaries. So I'm going to make one last point and now, when modern knowledge comes to us via colonialism, when capitalism comes to us via colonialism and gives to us the modern disciplines, of knowledge, it is afflicted by a certain doubling, a certain contradiction. Colonialism says to us, or the logic of colonialism, the logic of a civilizing mission is that we want to make of the uncivilized or the non-Western people, we want to turn them into civilized people so that they will be the same as us. That's the logic of colonialism. The colonialists come here and say that we want to transform the African, the savage African, into a modern human being so that he may be like us. Now here is the doubling, here is the internal contradiction. It is that the universality that is claimed for Western thought